Welcome to Vision to Value, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on how technology is planned, purchased, and implemented in state government health and human services agencies. Each episode explores the real challenges of transformation, from procurement pitfalls to leadership strategies, and provides bold insights to drive meaningful change. Your hosts, Carol Hussey and Tony Matthews, bring decades of experience from both public and private sector leadership. Together, Carol and Tony bring unfiltered insights and straight talk on what works, what doesn't, and how agencies and vendors can turn vision into real value. Now let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Vision to Value, the podcast where we discuss all things HHS modernization and transformation. Today, my co-host Tony Matthews and I are going to be discussing cross-systems collaboration, and we're going to discuss some myths, some mess, and some methods. So, there's been a lot of talk about cross-systems collaboration for well over a decade in health and human services, and I think most people would agree that we haven't made a whole lot of progress. But I do think everyone would kind of agree that it's valuable, right? There are meaningful ways that we can better serve clients who are served in a variety of health and human services programs, but there's also a lot of economy of scale and efficiencies and other things that can happen on the back end of that. So there's a lot of, I think, real business justification for cross-system collaboration. And I'm actually going to start calling it cross-program collaboration, because we like to talk here at Vision Value about transformation being not just about technology. It's about the people, right? And so we'll get into some of that today. But I'm going to just jump right in. Tony, one of the myths, that we hear from people is, well, we're already collaborating, right? And so what do you mean by that? And I think that it's important to collaborate, of course, in terms of serving people. But right now, the systems don't speak to each other. The data isn't typically integrated or shared well. Roles and responsibilities are very unclear. We're lacking formalized processes. And even where we say we're collaborating, like maybe we refer someone to a vocational rehab, program or some other community services, we're lacking those feedback loops too, to know whatever we're referring them to, is it even working? Did they actually go? There's no way for us really to measure this. But what do you think, Tony? Do you think that we have well-coordinated systems, or are we just having well-coordinated or not even coordinated conversations?
Well, clearly we're not. I think, when people say we're already collaborating, we're talking to each other, right? But I don't think we're integrating. And I think that's the rub that you're referring to. The magic word you didn't mention was data governance.
Yeah.
I think that's a big hurdle, right? Everybody defines income differently. Nobody can agree on who's the owner of something as simple as address. Mm-hmm. One program wants to change the address in the system because, the primary caregiver has got a new address, but another program says, no, that's not the primary address for the children. And so you can't even agree on something as simple as address, right? Mm-hmm. I have this weird sort of belief that there's somebody out there that's doing it right and has figured it out, and we just don't know about it.
Yeah.
And we just have to find that very quiet entity somewhere. Iowa, has figured it out, and they're just not telling anybody, how it works. So I sort of have this interesting sort of mythology in my own brain that it's working well somewhere. Mm-hmm. I think it's up to people like you and I to sort of figure that out, right? Ferret out, the best practices and share that with our audience so they can start to build on who's doing it best today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think I do want to jump into this, like spotlighting some people, because I agree with you. There are some people out there doing it well, in particular in counties, right? Because of course it's a little easier to do in a county than it is to do statewide. And so then we had to think about, how do we take some of those best practices in places where they're doing it well and then scale that and replicate it, right? Sure. But let's hang a little bit on sort of the mess, like in terms of what's holding us back. You mentioned governance gaps, not just with data, but like authority, and you alluded to that. But there's certainly like siloed funding streams, which I always go back to saying you do have the option to cost allocate across funding streams in HHS. It's hard but you can do it. So when we talk about siloed funding streams, I feel like that's a little bit of a cop out. There are ways to do that. It's hard. You talked at the beginning, we talked about technology, but there's also like culture and trust issues out there where maybe the agencies don't trust one another with their data, right? We talked about who owns the data, and maybe they don't share the values of, they don't see the value of that cross-programmatic collaboration as much as we see it. How would you address that as a former leader in an HHS agency?
Sure. Yeah, I think everyone sees the value in collaborating. One entity may benefit more from collaboration than another, but everybody benefits, I think. So I think everyone sees the value in it. I think what it comes down to, Carol, just being, honest, I think we all feel vulnerable about the quality of our own data. And I think we're all struggling day in and day out. We know we've got old data in there. We've got duplicates in there. And, think about people that can't even, clean out their email folders.
Right.
They can't stop long enough to clean out 18,000 emails, even though the server is maxed out. So I think a big part of this comes to my house isn't in order. The last thing I want to do is host somebody else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that's a part of it. We don't talk about that, but I think everybody feels vulnerable about how well they're managing their own data. And the only thing that can make that less of a value or less secure to us would be, now we're going to open it up to other people and let them use it and interact with it. I think that's a big part of it that we don't talk about.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. It is a vulnerable position to put yourself in. And maybe that recognition that all those other folks are struggling with the same sort of things, is something to consider. In terms of the technology limitations, I think a lot of the reason why there are limitations is not because the technology is incapable of doing it, but it's kind of like, some of these systems are just very, very old. And I think people perceive there to be technology limitations, or they assume that the technology solution is going to be too costly. And there are ways in which you can incrementally improve your ability to integrate or to connect with other organizations, whether that be, community partners or another agency at the state level. You can do these things, and even we'll talk a little bit about AI today, which we haven't talked a ton about AI in our podcast, and I'm excited about that. But with AI and data integration solutions and all kinds you can have a 30-year-old legacy system and it can still talk to a modern platform. There are ways to do that. So, I just want to encourage folks to think about that, and don't just assume that because you've got a bunch of old stuff that you can't do something with what you have. You can. But I do think sometimes the people aspects of cross-programmatic collaboration is really where a lot of the challenges lie. And even with data integration, one of the big barriers is, policy barriers, MOUs, like getting all that stuff sorted out before you even think about the technology is hard work, right?
Well, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing too, right? People, are uncomfortable with the policy changes to make it work if they don't understand how the technology is going to work.
Right.
Right. Like, you tell me how it's going to work first before I agree to share it. But we can't figure out the technology if you don't agree to tweak your policy. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg in that whole scenario.
Yeah, for sure. With policy changes, definitely. But I also think too, like, no knock against my legal friends. I feel like every episode I say, oh, sorry to some group of people. So sorry, my lawyer friends. But I think you got to figure out too, like, exactly what data do you need from your partner organization and how are you going to use it? Because the lawyers their job is to protect your agency. And so they're beginning with no, we're not going to share that with you. And they're certainly not going to share everything, right? Need to know. We all take our annual data sharing trainings and, this kind of thing. Everything should be need to know. Do you need this information to do your job? And it's not everything. So what might a a SNAP worker need to help better serve, a client who's coming in the door who might have other needs like housing or, whatever. How can we, work across these programs to better serve and provide, efficiencies even internally? But we got to be clear about what we need and how we're using it.
Well, and I mean, that's a great point. I think if you start with the end in mind and you think about, what are we trying to accomplish, right? By integrating and sharing data and systems. And it's, at the end of the day, we're trying to make it more efficient and effective and compliant for the people that we're here to serve. And so I think when you think about it sort of from that perspective, you have to back up and rethink some things that have probably been in place forever, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can't share the data unless people agree to share the data. And
Right.
contacting, thousands of people, getting them all to agree is burdensome. What if on your online portal or, the front door to your programs, there's an acknowledgement that, you have to opt out. Right.
Yeah.
And that's been a big debate for years, right? Is it okay to say we are going to share your data with other programs that will benefit you, right? We're not going to sell it. It's not going to be used for marketing. We're going to use it to help you get everything you're entitled to and need, unless you specifically opt out.
Yeah.
And that's, and I think that's a debate that a lot of states are having and have had is that cool to sort of default into, data sharing and make them opt out versus defaulting into we're not going to share unless you opt in.
Yeah. Yeah. And we actually have invited Rich Boland from Core Data is going to come speak to us in a few weeks about consent. And there's a whole body of work going on around the country regarding consent management. Because at the end of the day, what we want to argue about who owns the data at the state, but I own my data at the end of the day, right? And I should have some say in what, not only where it's being shared, but what is being shared and for what purpose. And I should have the ability to withdraw my consent if I choose to do so. And so there's like management of that. Where does that data, that common data live, and who manages that? Lots of stuff we'll be talking about in a future episode on that. But I think it's the key to a lot of things, right? It solves a lot of issues around like HIPAA and FERPA and things like that, because if I authorize you to share my data, now those other things, they're less concerning because I've permitted, the use of that. So cool stuff around consent happening around the country.
Well, and I think as we evolve technologically as a culture and as a society, I think people are, I think, diverging into, everybody's got all my information, you use it. If it benefits me, that's fine. You've got my address just by looking at my mailbox already. Like, I don't care. But then there's the other side that's going more toward sort of the paranoia about all the risk associated with the dark web and data breaches. And people don't trust the fact that their data is going to be protected because big banks and telecom companies and everybody with very sophisticated security have had breaches. And so I think that's part of sort of the dynamic that you've got to manage through.
Yeah. And I think you can't just assume that, that consent thing is going to work for everyone, right? And it's the same way we used to have to think about paper versus digital. Not everybody wants digital, so we're going to keep our paper processes. Right. Some people still like to come into the office to talk to their caseworker in person, right? So we must always have a variety of ways of managing things, and knowing that not everyone is going to agree. We still have to follow all of the laws and regulations that govern that for sure. So,
and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I do think it's worth mentioning that applies to employees too. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times when we talk about improving processes and serving the people that we need to serve, we forget that a big piece of that is the employees. Yeah. And when you talked about going into the office, I was shocked when we digitized everything and we established remote work ahead of everybody else, right before COVID hit, that that some of the feedback we got was, I didn't sign up to be a data entry clerk in Knoxville and processing applications for people that live in Memphis.
Yeah.
Like, I signed up to go into the office, look at people in the eye across the counter, and help them, with what their needs are, and watch their family grow and watch them, become more independent. And so I think we forget that part.
Yeah.
And so that's a whole OCM sort of conversation that we've had before, but I do want to be cognizant of, we can get down this sort of technology rabbit hole and think we've solved it all, with technology. And then we forget the fact that there's a human employee element to this that you've got to factor in when you're making these decisions.
Yeah. People get into this business because they have a heart for that. And, they like doing that. They like helping people. So we don't want to completely, we certainly will always have a place for people in our industry. I don't see any way around it. We can automate a lot of things, but we can't automate the people part.
That's right.
Let's talk about, everybody's on board now. We understand there's going to be some challenges, but we want to go forward. We talked about governance, kind of, I think one thing that's typically universal is there is a shared desire to help people, like we were just talking about, right? Like, people that get into health and human services, they do want to help families to strengthen the families, to thrive in communities, all of those things. So you come at it, immediately with shared values and shared outcomes. And then you kind of get that governance, structure established with your legal, your IT, your business, community partners, people with lived experience. I'm always advocating for that. What else do you think it takes to start to move toward, real collaboration and interoperability?
So I think it takes, once you've got all that, which is a very heavy lift, I think it takes leadership, sort of a step back to sort of see the big picture, see the whole field, so to speak. It's your CIOs for the different departments that need to be sort of working together. It's your operations people and some of your leadership for the different. I think about education and human services. Very different sort of models for how to do and conduct business. But there's a lot of, because, all children have to go to school, there's a lot of integration that could happen there. But if you've got education people that think the world revolves around education and they don't want to change anything or risk compliance or funding, allocation, and you've got DHS people, same thing, right? They feel like the world revolves around human services. And, if they can't both get in a room and sort of stand back at sort of that 10,000 foot level and see the collective value of working together to make both entities more integrated and more efficient and effective, it doesn't matter if you did all that other stuff.
Yeah.
And so I do think the next step, besides the legal stuff and the privacy stuff and the sharing and the data governance and all the important things, the foundational stuff, at the end of the day, if you don't have leaders that see the value in working together and sort of making some compromises on some things to make it work better for everyone, you're dead in the water.
Yeah. I don't know if we've had a podcast yet where we didn't talk about leadership, right? I mean, it's just so important. And, I think some of this too can even come right out of the governor's office. Like, when I think about interoperability across agencies, that almost has to come from the governor's office, because otherwise, and I think you alluded to this earlier, like, people are doing the best they can. They're working really hard. They've got limited budgets. They're barely keeping their heads above water. How can they step out of that to be like, oh, let's collaborate, right? Like, that's why some people are like, yeah, I'm in survival mode over here. How am I going to do that?
Yeah.
So unless you've got governors' offices, kind of pushing for this, or federal funding partners or whatever, how's that going to happen?
Yeah, I think the trick with that is, you can have a governor's office that says, hey, I want you two to collaborate, go collaborate, play nice in the sandbox together. Well, you can say that all day. It doesn't always happen. So I think it's got to be something more than that. It's got to be some sort of facilitation to where, that individual out of the governor's office, the chief operating officer or somebody in that type of a role has to sort of be in the room, especially at the beginning, to make sure that the different parties get the spirit of what they're being instructed to do.
Yeah.
And they're identifying any sort of, well, we can't use their address data because we have this requirement over here. And then the other entity said, well, we can't use, they've only got kids in the school 9 months of the year. That leaves us a big hole during the summer when we don't, the addresses change and people move. And so I think unless you're facilitating that sort of, mandated coordination and collaboration, it may or may not happen.
Yeah.
And I've seen it both ways where, hey, stop what you're doing. You're being too rigid. Work with them. I'm not playing around. And it doesn't happen. And then you see other times where it's like, hey, this is important to administration's, goals and aspirations. And people are like, okay, the governor thinks this is important. So it can happen both ways, even within the same administration. So I think that's a big part of it. I think if you don't have the leadership for the different entities that need to coordinate and collaborate together, if they're not pulling in the same direction, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
You have to have that. Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about that before, right? Like where someone in a leadership position has to say, okay, I'm going to let you off the hook on some of these KPIs for, the next, 3 months. So you can go sort of get a game plan for this thing that we're going to do and make that happen. And that's where those, priorities come into place, because otherwise I'm sitting over here worrying about my SNAP error rates and how I'm going to fix that. Right.
That's right.
The things that I'm obligated by law to do are always going to be my top priority. And
that's right.
This can feel like nice to have.
Well, exactly. Well, and most people, they default, you get what you measure. And most people default to what they're measured by. And typically your performance review isn't based on, there's no metric for collaboration.
Yeah, right.
There's a metric for your SNAP error rate and timeliness of turnarounds for applications and appeals. And there's all these measurable things. That's what people are going to focus on first. Like you said, must-haves, because at the end of the day, that's what I'm going to be evaluated on. There's no metric in my performance review for collaboration.
Right.
So that's the last thing I'm going to worry about is that I got to get all this other stuff done first. And then it's a nice to have if I have time to collaborate.
Yeah. And so, but I do think that there is a bit more urgency around cross-programmatic collaboration and now than perhaps there has been in the past. Like I said, we've talked about it for over a decade, probably close to 2. That's how long I've been around, but longer. But there's a new administration in town, right? And there's some things that the administration wants that I think interoperability and cross collaboration can solve for. But I also think even prior to that, in previous administrations, like you look at like child welfare and the movement to prevention. We talk about getting upstream. Getting upstream from child welfare is the tail of the dog. If I want to get upstream, that happens through food and childcare and housing and all kinds of things that don't happen in child welfare in their purview, right? So when I think about that, if we're going to prevent that, we have to be collaborating because the front door of child welfare is too late to help people. I mean, generally speaking, that's not where you don't want child welfare knocking on your door. So these complex family needs and spanning all of these different systems, when we have very fragmented technologies, policies, et cetera, I think it has been the barrier, but now how do we take this more urgency of helping people, of being efficient, saving money, meeting our regulatory requirements? Like you look at the CFSRs for child welfare, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about family well-being that does not happen within the child welfare agency necessarily. So how do we now, the states are under pressure, right, to do all these things. And we, in theory, can say we believe interoperability will help that. but do you believe there's real urgency now, or is that am I overestimating that?
I, I think the more conscientious states, right, and departments within those states feel that sense of urgency.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are states that are more bureaucratic,
Yeah.
and unless it's a mandate, it's not. It's only as urgent as the requirement is. So I think
Hmm.
there are certain more progressive states that are
Yeah.
trying to be in front of things, that they internalize that urgency that you're talking about. And
Hmm.
I don't want to pick on anybody, so I'm not going to call
Right.
anybody, give anybody props. But there's a handful of states that are always sort of out front, trying to get in front of
Oh
things.
yeah.
And then I think that there's a lot of states that, unless there's some sort of federal mandate, I don't have the resources to prioritize
Right.
anything else.
Move on then and talk a little bit about the AI connection with interoperability. We talked a little bit earlier about people not trusting their data and fragmented systems and all of those things. And without AI, we're really missing out on critical context and things that can help actually serve people better. So what are your thoughts around AI and how that could help accelerate or cause problems with interoperability?
There's no question AI is the future, right? I mean, I think we that's not an if question, that's a when. And we could probably do 3 podcasts episodes on just how to leverage AI in this scenario. But I do think it goes back to what we referenced earlier about why people are less inclined to collaborate. I think there's an insecurity around your own data and how clean it is, and like we mentioned, that couldn't be more important when it comes to AI. We
Mm,
talked about that previously, where the AI is only as good and useful as the data that feeds it. And
yeah.
so if you've got 2 different entities, one that's pretty advanced with their data, the cleanliness and accuracy, and another one that's not, and there's a lot of junk in there, um, then the AI is not going to be as effective, and you're not
Yep.
going to trust it because it's not using the same quality data to do what it needs to do, right? So
Hmm.
I think that, as you're sort of building sort of the stepping stones for what has to happen in what order to solve this, this integration and collaboration problem. Um, we talked about governance and all the other things that go into it, security and, HIPAA requirements and all that. I do think that at some point that data cleanliness is critical. And if both players don't have that, in-house, cleaned up enough with their data, then they're not going to leverage AI to the same extent.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And interoperability can be the way to get that data cleaned up, right? Like that effort's going to have to
Yeah,
happen
that's right.
for interoperability. So it's a good prerequisite. Um, I think that's about all we have time for today, but do you want to share any kind of final thoughts or call to action, Tony, about what leaders should be doing today to advance cross-programmatic collaboration for their agencies?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things that's missing in state government is people talking to each other, even at the same level. Even if you've got deputy commissioners, that are talking to each other across programs. I think what happens is we all get in our silos. We all have so many pressures and requirements of ourselves, whether it's people or processes or technology, and we're all in the weeds every day. And I don't think that we spend enough time sort of get out of the office and talk to your counterparts in the other agencies about the challenges that you're facing, things that you've done successfully that you're proud of that somebody else might be able to leverage. And maybe somebody else has solved a problem that you're having. So I
Yeah.
think when you talk about integration, it kind of starts with the people that are going to have to drive it, sort of doing that with each other.
Yeah.
And so they see, they see the value, right? Education may only, it may only help them 5% to integrate with human services. And, human services, it may benefit them 15%. Okay.
Mhm.
But we're both benefiting
Yeah.
by integrating. So I think it starts with sort of establishing that sort of state government leadership culture of talking to each other about your struggles, it's a monthly lunch, where everybody in the, the Medicaid and the human services and child protection and, children's services and education, they just, people at the same level all go to lunch once a month and talk
Right.
about what they're struggling with and what they've recently, accomplished, and see how that resonates with your counterparts. I think it sort of starts there.
Yeah, just start the conversation. And, I would just add to that, you don't have to, it can feel really overwhelming. You don't have to do it all at once, right? Start
Right.
small, maybe pilot something small in a county level, and then look at how you might be able to scale and expand that. But you got to shift the focus from compliance to value, right? And outcomes.
That's a great point.
And the federal government is expecting that. They've been indicating that they want to see value for the investments that they make. So your federal funding partners want to see this too. They don't just care about compliance. They want to know that the investments that they make are actually making a difference. So if you can identify that and work on it on a small level and prove that, then you'll be well on your way.
Carol, that's a great point. The other thing that I think folks could do, ask your federal partners, hey, what states are crushing it?
Yeah.
And can I get a contact number? Who are you happiest with? Who do you think is doing it that you wish everybody else was doing it like them? And let me give them a call and see what they're doing that we're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
And I recently was at an event and ACF was there speaking, and they said, look, we want to see some small scale things, proofs of concept and pilots. And, they're inviting that. So work with them, pitch them your idea. I think they're going to be eager to see that. This episode really, I think, in a lot of ways, I wanted this topic to really inspire our listeners to reflect on where your agency stands. And it's not just buzzy words. It actually can make a big difference in the lives of the people you're serving, but also in terms of the just operational excellence of your organization and making things easier for your workers. So thank you for, being with us today and listening to this topic. We hope you're enjoying Vision to Value. I think this one really teed up some future topics for us. And we know we've got some visitors coming, and we're going to be having more and more guests in the future. So we'd love your feedback. Tell us what you're doing in regard to interoperability, or if you know of somebody that's doing an incredible job, we'd love to have them on the show. Send them our way. And if you love the show, please follow us on YouTube so you get those updates when new episodes are released. And of course, we always drop it on LinkedIn as well. And thanks for coming today. We'll see you next time on Vision to Value.